Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to that Christian Nerd channel. So, in today's video, we are going to be talking about evolution and interviewing someone that I've made content with in the past on this very topic. But before that, I need to make a couple of announcements, do some introductions, and a couple other things. Of course, it is August, so school is starting back up for me, both my early fall classes and then the semester is going to officially kick off. So, in terms of long form YouTube content, that is going to come out, but possibly at a pace that I at least did not initially want. I wanted to pump those things out a little bit faster, but we may have to slow that down for a little bit just so I can keep up with school and stuff like that. Excuse me. On a related note, I was supposed to get the next part of the biblical slavery series out, looking at the slave laws in the Old Testament. I'm still working on that. And with the addition of school and stuff like that, it's going to be a little more complicated. But I am working on it, and even some school research I'm doing is going towards that. So once that script is finished, I can definitely let people know, and we can go from there. I'm very excited about it in the series, though, as a whole, because the discussion of biblical slavery is a very important one for a lot of different reasons. And it's something that is constantly brought up when you bring up maybe the terrible stuff in the Bible or something like that. So a few other things to mention. So, I have a video right now that I am working on editing that is talking about, or that is reading Reddit stories, basically, from the Christianity subreddit. So, I have been coming across a lot of videos through my feed and through some content I watch where people are just reading and reacting or commenting on Reddit stories. And I thought this would be an interesting idea to integrate both Reddit and YouTube, and also frame it in a way that makes sense for my content and you guys, the audience that I have cultivated. So I decided to read some Reddit stories. So that will be out hopefully this week, even. Definitely this month, I'm hoping. So I will be working on that as well. I'm still trying to get gaming content on the platform. So, of course, I'm doing this in my home now with my own computer, which means that I don't have to like ask permission from Grace or something like that to download video games or anything like that onto my computer. So, um, I was messing around trying to do that, trying to play this particular game, and I kept running into frame rate issues and even adjusting for settings and a couple of things. It just wouldn't work. So, my hope though is that I can figure out a solution so I can have like long form gaming content be a part of the platform. That way, I'm not just like talking about games like in my short form videos or something like that. It is a type of content that I miss making for YouTube and stuff. So I'm hoping to get that back on as well. Um, there are a couple things. So I have some other video ideas. I'm trying to set up some more interviews and other long form content, some more live streams like this. Um, where I'm going to be interviewing someone who is a celibate gay Christian. So they are same sex attracted, but they hold to historic Christian sexual ethics, and they live in vocational singleness, as they would say. So my hope is to bring him on a live stream to interview him as well. I think he has great content, and I think he is a much needed voice in the midst of a lot of the things that we see, or at least I see online pertaining to uh, topics of queerness and Christianity. So hopefully I can get that together. There's another interview I am trying to get together as well, where I talked to a reporter about the church. They are, uh, I would say, relatively famous, uh, and they have reported a lot on church abuse and church issues. So I am interested in talking to them about. Um, Interested in talking to them about some of the issues in the church, some of the things they reported on, where we can learn all of that sort of stuff as well. Um, yeah. Also, one other thing to mention, um, there are links in the description of this video to both the work that Dr. Seth Hart has done on this topic, at least the article that he written on this topic that was published in a academic Catholic journal. There is a link to my link tree to Dr. Seth Hart's podcast that he does with Dr. Lionheart. I don't know if you will remember him, but Dr. Lionheart is someone that I also interviewed, and him and Seth Hart are friends. And so they have a podcast together where they interview all sorts of interesting people from all different faiths and perspectives. So it's called the Spiritually Incorrect Podcast. I would encourage you to check it out. It's down in the description. Another thing that you can also find is links to the videos that we have done previously. So me and Dr. Hart did a initial live stream where we argued for, or at least he argued for and defended evolutionary creationism, also known as theistic evolution. Uh, Me and him also did a long form video tackling some of the claims of Candace Owens. If you don't know, Candace Owens is, I believe, a Catholic, conservative political commentator, and black female political commentator. And she kind of went viral for claiming that dinosaurs were fake and gay, among other things that she said in this particular interview that she was in. And this happened, I believe, in sometime in 2024. And so, me and Dr. Hart teamed up to respond to that. We would say, scientifically literate, or at least I'm trying to be a scientifically literate Christian. He's much more literate in that than I am, and his interest was actually dinosaurs. He actually wanted to be a paleontologist. So that combined with some of the other stuff she said, just we were like a perfect duo to respond to that sort of thing. So I would encourage you guys to check all that out too. I think he has great content over on the podcast, and we've been able to do some pretty awesome stuff together as well. I am currently waiting for Dr. Hart. Speaking of which, he said that he is in a meeting, kind of stuck in a meeting at the moment. So hopefully he can get out of that soon. So please be patient with us. In the meantime, there are some other things I can talk about. So, on top of like class and the work I'm doing for content and jobs and all of that, I would ask you guys to pray for me as I am also doing a internship at a church. So, I interviewed who's at least my pastor since I've moved to this campus, Pastor Ryan. I interviewed in a live stream you guys can go check out on the Church in Nazarene and its theology and practice. So I would encourage you guys to check that out. But I am interning now at his church, and it's been a really fun experience, really been cool. But he does want me to preach my first sermon at some point this semester, maybe even in August at the earliest. So please pray for me on that. It is definitely something I want to do, a ministry career I want to pursue, pastoral ministry, that is. And of course, crafting a sermon is obviously going to be crucial with that. That's biblically accurate, that resonates with people, that's going to help people in their walk with Christ, right? And that's no easy task, right? It's no light work, let's say. So, excuse me. So I would appreciate prayers and support for that as I talk with him and continue working continue working in administrative related capacity. Also, a really fun thing that I will definitely be talking about in short form videos, possibly have a longer video talking about it, because I would love to make some long form content on this for you guys. But I am a huge nerd, and one of the things I got into was D&D. And at the moment, I am planning my uh, my fourth D&D campaign, as a dungeon master, at least, the person who's running and sort of creating the campaign. So this has been really fun, really awesome. I actually just finished one that I was doing over the summer, so that's something I'm going to be talking about as well in videos to come this August. But I am planning one to do during the semester as well, on top of everything else that I'm doing. So obviously, pray that that goes well, and uh, make sure to yeah, definitely keep me in your prayers about all that, because it's going to be, a big workload. But I think I can do it, and I'm very excited to do it. I've been thinking about like what I'm going to do with this, because this campaign that I am running for some friends on campus is a sequel to one that we've done, and so you know, um, being able to like correct any previous mistakes that I made while also attempting to do better in the future. And with this future campaign is definitely a strong desire of mine. So definitely keep me in your prayers about that. Um, Related to my preaching, so when I do, so the church, the Clyde Park Church of Nazarene that I would be preaching at, if I get the opportunity to, will be they live stream all of their sermons and services. So you would be able to find my sermon on YouTube. I may also find a way to like download the live stream and cut my sermon part out and upload it to the channel. That could be an interesting idea as well, and helpful for their content and my content. So yeah, if and when I do preach my first sermon, I think that can definitely be shared across the different social media platforms. But yeah, definitely keep me in your prayers regarding all of that. Yep, so I am still waiting on the meeting to end so that Dr. Hart can join us. Uh, this is low key on me because we decided to schedule this live stream pretty close to the meeting, so but he should be on soon. I don't think I have anything else to mention, but I am definitely excited for this live stream, and hoping that me and Dr. Hart can do more content in the future. Seems like a really nice guy and um, someone who is like very eclectic in their knowledge. Ah, here he is. Give me 1 second, guys. Oh, you are shrouded in dark.
I am shrouded in darkness. How do I switch up my camera? Let's see. There we go.
There
Perfect.
you go. Hey, how you doing?
Hey, sorry about my lateness. Had a meeting run long.
Oh no, you're good. You're good. I just talked everyone's ear off until you were ready to until you were ready to come
Whopping
on.
15 minutes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I'm good at what I do. What can I say? So
Fair enough.
So all the announcements and stuff are out of the way, and so hi, Dr. Hart, how are you doing? Go ahead and introduce yourself for to the audience and for those who don't know.
Yeah, it
Cool.
looks like my title got cut off. It was too long. I'm the assistant professor of biblical studies and theology at John Brown University. I work a lot in science and theology, that dialogue. I've graduated with my master's in science and religion from Oxford University with Alistair McGrath, and more recently, got my PhD in science and theology from Durham University over in the UK. And specifically, the work that we're going to be talking about today has to do with that project.
Awesome, awesome. It's interesting. So if anyone doesn't know, like Alistair McGrath is a huge name in Christian academic spaces, and for those who are interested in Christian academic work, I forget like exactly what his expertise is and stuff, but I've seen him cited in a lot of like book recommendations and endorsements as well.
So he is, I believe, as of a couple of years ago, I haven't updated myself since then, the most cited British theologian alive.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah, so
wow.
he has specializations in historical theology, systematics, philosophical theology, but he teaches in science and theology. That's where because he's got a PhD in biophysics and a PhD in theology.
That is wild. He sounds like if you guys don't know, I interviewed Dr. Scott Shaw on biblical counseling versus Christian counseling. You guys can go check that out as well. But that man has so many degrees. He is ridiculous when it comes to that.
Yeah, I have 5 myself, but McGrath he's got 3 doctorates.
Wow.
3 doctorates, all from Oxford. He actually completed his bachelor's in theology while finishing his PhD in biophysics. Did that simultaneously.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wish I had the money and expertise.
Yeah, highly recommend his works. If you ever find a work from him, it's an authoritative work.
For sure, for sure. So, give us a introduction to the work you are doing on theistic evolution, your dissertation thesis, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Theistic evolution, dissertation. Oh, yeah, a lot. So, theistic evolution is broadly the idea that evolution, some form of evolution occurred and God was somehow involved in some way. So it's a very broad term. If you are a theist and if you believe in evolution and if you believe God had some sort of interaction with the process, you broadly are speaking a theistic evolutionist. Another term is used today to try and denote a more active role of God in the creation process, in the evolutionary process, excuse me, and it's called evolutionary creationism. And usually those who go by that label are usually much more apt to talk about God's causal role and find ways to think about God actively creating, or you don't have to think of creation and evolution as 2 distinct categories, but one and the same. My dissertation looks at the classical vision, Christian vision of what creation, God's causal activity in the universe is, then looks at evolution and then tries to form a model for how God might be seen to causally interact with the evolutionary process. One that doesn't just, sort of complement the evolutionary process, but actually solve some issues that have plagued philosophers of biology for going on half a century.
Gotcha. So we should define some important terms, especially because we can't assume that everyone understands all of this, or even some of
Sure.
this. So help us understand what evolution is, or natural selection, fitness, and other things related to evolution.
Yeah. So evolution and Darwinism are often thought of as the same thing. They're not. There have been many different ideas of evolution over time. And Darwinism is broadly speaking the contemporary view that evolution happens by natural selection, or it's driven primarily by natural selection. So evolution is just the view that biological organisms all derive from common descent. In other words, that if you look at the various species, the biodiversity across the world, well, even though for as diverse as organisms are, there is a sort of common ancestor between different species of organisms, and that there was a process of differentiation and change over time. So that when we look into the fossil record, that's why the biodiversity, say, of the Mesozoic era, of the Jurassic period, looks so different from today. That's broadly speaking evolution. Well, how that happens, what is the engine? What is the cause of that? Well, that has been a debate across history. You go back before Darwin, there were views from people like Lamarck, who had a very different view of how evolution happened, which is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. If I do something to my body, change my body in any way, that will pass on to my children. That was one view. Well, Darwin comes along and proposes a different mechanism, a different way for evolution to happen, which was natural selection, sometimes reduced down to the idea of survival of the fittest. And I think that is an apt description. If we're going to simplify it, a lot of things get overly simplified. And to a point, survival of the fittest is overly simplified, but it's better than most because it hits on a very key term in evolutionary biology, and that is the concept of fitness. Fitness is a much debated term. But before I get into that, I should talk about the function it plays. Basically, in evolutionary biology, in population genetics, there is a term called fitness. And fitness is this idea that certain populations have a greater propensity to leave offspring, have a greater survival and reproduction rate than other groups of organisms, than other populations. In other words, they're more fit. You get a certain number of bigger, stronger, more fit lions. Over time, they're going to leave more offspring and survive better than the not so strong, not so fit lions. It's sometimes overly simplistically characterized as that, but it gets the idea across, is that these big, strong lions have certain genes that allow them to survive better and therefore are more fit. The less strong lions have genes that don't allow for that. And so what population geneticists will do is they can actually map how populations change over time and get an actual value of saying this gene provides this level of fitness. If you have this gene, which makes you bigger, stronger, more capable of catching prey, it actually gives you a certain fitness increase over time. And therefore, we can predict, this gives us a level of predictability to evolution, that over time, this gene will propagate and overtake the other gene in the environment. So that's broadly speaking what the term fitness is. It doesn't answer the question of where variation comes in. And that's, of course, a different question. How did that gene come about to begin with? Right? Where do these new traits come about so that they can then outcompete other traits or be outcompeted by other traits? But broadly speaking, that's what natural selection says. It's not an answer to where variation comes from. And Darwin himself, bemused and kind of wrestled with the idea of where do these new traits come from? That's not what natural selection is. It says, given the variety that we do have, certain traits will outcompete other traits, given the fact that there's only a finite amount of resources.
And so as a quick clarification, like a lot of people, when they talk about evolution, will talk about randomness and how either like evolution is just this like random process and that, doesn't make sense or doesn't fit within a Christian worldview and things like that. But based on this understanding of natural selection and fitness, it doesn't seem totally random. Like there is a predictability to it, especially if something adapts to its environment. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that evolution is random. Now, this gets into some deep philosophy of what do we mean by random? What does that mean? Now, what that normally means is that there's no discernible overarching purpose to evolution. In other words, that if you look from the early microbes from billions of years ago to us now, you wouldn't be able to look at those microbes and be able to discern that eventually humans were going to come about. It's random in that way, not in the sense that God might not have a plan. I mean, quite a few evolutionary biologists have believed that God might have a plan in all of this, or did have a plan. The idea of randomness here is that when variations and these sorts of new traits come about, they're not coming about for the intent of the benefit of the organism. In other words, we can't discern when we see a new trait pop up in a population. We can't say that trait arose so that it can outcompete other traits and therefore become fixed within the population. That's not something we can discern. For all intents and purposes, these variations that pop up are random. Now, once they do pop up, it's not random. There's a level of predictability to this. A better trait comes about, there's a high % chance that it will outcompete other traits. So it's not completely random in that sort of way. So the randomness, it sometimes is overplayed and is sometimes read very anti-theologically, even by some biologists themselves will do this, and they overstep what biology can actually say. The randomness is merely meant to denote that when we observe new traits in a population, we can't go out and then say, hey, this trait popped up to help the population survive this or that, right? There's nothing that gives us the warrant to say that.
Gotcha. So, on a related note to definitions, how do we understand teleology?
Yeah, teleology. So that's a big term for that's a huge term, obviously. Teleology, broadly speaking, is the study of purpose, goals, indirectedness. It's the idea of that something is teleological if you can say there's an ought to it. There's something that it's going toward, it's pointed towards in some way. So to give you an illustration, earlier today I got up and made myself a coffee. Now, here's the thing. There's two ways that I can explain this. I can explain this mechanistically. I can say, what's the explanation for me getting up and getting a coffee? And that would be an explanation by nerves firing and then muscle joints contracting. And I can explain it that way. That would be an explanation by the mechanisms that allowed it to happen. Or there's another way I can explain it. I got myself a coffee because I was thirsty. Both are explanations of the same event, but one explains it mechanistically, the other way explains it teleologically, the goal or the purpose of it. So that's what we mean by teleology. Anything that denotes purpose or goal orientation. In apologetics, sometimes you'll hear about the teleological arguments. And most famously now is the fine-tuning argument, where we observe that certain constants and quantities in the early universe were seem to be fine-tuned for the eventual arrival of intelligent life. And people call this a teleological argument because it seems to at least suggest in their minds that this was put there with intent or goal orientation. They're reading teleology out of this. That this, if these parameters are in place, it seems like they're there for a purpose, so that life would eventually arise. So that's what teleology is, broadly speaking. It's not design. Sometimes we read this, we hear this word, we think design. That's not what it is. Design is a particular kind of teleology. But with my example with the coffee, that I wouldn't say that that's a designed thing. There's no design in there. There's no specified complexity, to use William Dembski's term. It's just a goal orientation. I just naturally see a goal orientation. Or if you look in my office and you see a bunch of papers and there's a rock on top of it to weigh them down. There's no design there. I'm not looking at the specifics and reading the complexity or anything like that. I just notice some good end is being met. And he's using it as a paperweight. So teleology is a broader category of purpose and goal orientation. And so for my project, what I wanted to do is ask, is there teleology in the concept of natural selection? So to bring these two together, this is probably where you want us to go from here, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, is to bring these two together, is to ask the question, does natural selection have some implicit form of teleology in it? Because the thing about teleology is it's weird. Mechanistic explanations are easy to reconcile with a materialistic or physicalistic or naturalistic worldview, an atheistic worldview. You know, it's just the nerves firing, it's just the muscles contracting, it's just that's the sort of normal way we think of causation happening. Teleology is tougher to explain because in the case of, me putting the rock on the papers, that's not anything physical about that. I'm inferring a mental cause in that case. Teleology seems any sort of purpose or goal orientation seems to be the product of minds. This is a mental thing because there's nothing. So, for instance, when I'm getting the coffee, I'm doing it because I'm thirsty. That's a mental process. That's an explanation by the purposes and desires of a mind. So, teleological explanations, well, it's easy to account in this case because it's me. I have a mind. But if teleology is implicit to natural selection, well, a lot of philosophers and a lot of biologists don't like that because evolution's been going on for 4.some billion years or 3.9 billion years. So how do you explain that? How do you explain a mental property being a part of a process that's going back billions of years? That's where you get into the question of, can teleology, if teleology is a part of natural selection, now all of a sudden you might have a gateway for understanding how the divine might be involved. That's very broad, and I haven't defended anything yet. So if your audience is listening, they have objections, they rightly do, because I'm just presenting the issue.
Gotcha. So, in your work specifically, you identified two problems with current models of fitness.
Yeah.
Going, into your thesis now, what are those problems? Have scientists noted these issues,
Mhm.
and how might what you propose solve those problems?
Well, it's actually not so much the scientists as the philosophers of science who have noticed this issue. Scientists will use competing different definitions of the same term all the time. Because quite often in the scientific literature, logical precision isn't as important as just getting good results, and that's fine. That's the goal of philosophers, to come in after the fact and provide some conceptual clarity. So, right now, there's something like a dozen different concepts of the term species. The word
Yeah,
species has multiple different concepts, and that's fine as long as a biologist is kind of clarifying. They're not really drawing sharp lines, or they're drawing sharp enough lines that you know what they're talking about. That's fine. But then, of course, then that opens the question of, is there such thing as, are species actually real things? And that's a philosopher of biology question. The biologists themselves shouldn't have to worry about that. The philosophers come in and do that. Same thing is actually happening with the term fitness. What philosophers of biologists have noticed is that the word fitness is often used in different ways. And what I've done is, there is a massive literature on this, and I've tried my best to simplify it with some easy categories. So, in that paper that I sent to you and in my thesis, what I basically do is I bring up two competing problems that philosophers have noticed with the different concepts of fitness. One is called the problem of nominalism, and the other is called the problem of tautology. So, let's ask, what is fitness? Well, when I began, I said basically it's this idea that there are certain properties allow you to outcompete other organisms. Okay, so what are those properties? Well, it's going to be different. The sharp teeth of, say, a shark, maybe he has slightly sharper teeth that allows him to hunt prey better. Well, that's a very different property from, say, the white fur of a polar bear, which allows him to blend into his environment. So, what do the white fur of a polar bear and the sharp teeth of a shark, what do those two things have in common? Nothing. So, we can't identify fitness with the cause of selection, because the cause is going to be different in every single different case. It'll be the whiteness of a polar bear's fur. It'll be the sharp teeth of a shark. It'll be the size of a giant whale or an elephant. So it's going to be different every single time. It's basically any trait that helps you survive is going to allow for fitness. And that's what I call the problem of nominalism. When biologists label those traits, any trait that causes increased survival and reproduction, when they label those fit traits, the problem then becomes is the word fitness just becomes a name with no underlying commonalities that it's designating. So it just means anything. It could mean anything as long as it provides the same effect, which is increased survival and reproduction, right?
Hmm.
So that's not good, right? If you're trying to say fitness is the cause of natural selection, we're providing an explanation for how natural selection happens, and it's fitness. Well, what's fitness? It's anything that causes survival and reproduction. Basically, that reduces to
Hmm.
what causes survival and reproduction? Anything that causes survival and reproduction.
Right.
That's not a good explanation. It would be like saying, why is my car white? Well, it's whatever caused it to be white. Oh, okay, thanks. Thanks. Completely explained now. See, that's not an explanation, right? And the whole
Hmm.
point of fitness is to provide a causal reason for why certain traits outcompete other traits. So, what's another concept of fitness then tries to identify it with its effect. And I've already sort of brought us into this, right? If it's not the individual causes, then maybe it's the effect. It's any trait that causes survival and reproduction. Well, then it's tautological. That's the problem of tautology, which is basically that it doesn't explain anything. What causes survival and reproductive success? Whatever causes survival and reproductive success. That's a tautology. It's true, but it's non-explanatory. We
Hmm.
can't treat fitness as a cause anymore. Honestly nearly becomes a worthless concept conceptually. Um, so we don't want to do that, and quite often biologists will flip between the two. I've noticed even within the same papers, they'll flip between these two different concepts of fitness, and it's easy enough to sort of hide behind this because in population genetics, fitness is actually a variable, and they can assign a number to it, and what that number is an expected sort of reproductive output. And so it ends up being a sort of average effect over time. But then they
Mm,
treat that effect as if it's a cause. So if I have a
mm,
fitness, a fitness, like a trait gives me a fitness with a certain number, that determines the number of uh, offspring that I might be expected to produce, right? So it's sort of hidden behind this variable, this problem, and this is what philosophers of biologists consistently bring up. But once you actually start to parse it out, you either arrive at the problem of nominalism, overly locating it in the cause of selection, or the problem of tautology, overly locating it in the effect of selection. So it's two horns of a dilemma. Fitness can't be the cause of selection because there is no one cause. It can be white fur, sharp teeth, whatever. Fitness can't be the effect of selection because then it literally just becomes a tautology. You know,
mm.
survival of whoever happens to survive, not survival of the fittest. So, what do? We do not have a coherent concept of fitness that allows us to treat the Darwinian mechanism as a true mechanism, as a true cause of natural selection. And so
Mm.
that's what I begin to problematize is just I'm not doing any new work here other than trying to provide broad categories. This has been a problem for something like 50 years in the
Mm.
philosophy of biology. And it's been a problem that has no obvious solution.
Gotcha.
And if
Gotcha.
you don't believe me, here's what I always tell: go
Mhm.
to the Stanford Encyclopedia. Um, go to the online philosophy encyclopedia. The article on fitness was written by Alex Rosenberg. Now, if that
Mm.
name sounds familiar, it's because he is a very staunch new atheist. He's debated William Lane Craig. So he is
Mm.
no friend to anything that I stand for. He wrote the article on fitness because he does philosophy of biology. Go read that if you don't believe me. Go read the first paragraph, and he presents the same thing.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yep. So this is a pretty known problem. You're not like, coming up with anything new here in that sense, right?
Yeah.
So what how does a Christian framework or your framework help solve this problem? How does what you
Yeah.
propose help solve this issue?
So what I end up doing is I basically say, is I look at the problem and I say, what happens if we start looking at this through the lens of classical Christian theology? And I don't want to overly commit myself to the theologians out there, to Thomas Aquinas, but nevertheless, I use Thomas Aquinas as sort of token example. And I say, does Thomas Aquinas, is his view of causation, can it help us to get out of this dilemma? And my answer is yes. Because Thomas Aquinas, when he thought about causation, when I use that term cause, remember very early on, I said there's two kinds of explanations. I said there's a mechanistic and a teleological.
Right.
When Thomas Aquinas thought about causal explanations, he says both have to be together. And in fact, the teleological explanation, he called it the cause of causes. It's the primary one. It's the one that you need to make sense of the other ones. So, for instance, with my coffee example, why are my muscles contracting and I'm moving and my neurons firing in the way they are? Because I'm thirsty and want a cup of coffee. The teleology explains the mechanistic cause. Now, both work together, right? But
Mm.
the more fundamental one there is the teleology. If you get rid of that one, you no longer have the mechanistic one. I'm not going to be moving around doing anything.
Right.
So, when there is a teleological explanation, it is the most important one. And what I basically say is, what if we thought of fitness as not as a mechanistic sort of cause, but as a teleological one? What if we thought of fitness in a similar way to how Thomas Aquinas might have thought of fitness? And
Mm.
that to me, immediately all the pieces came together. Because one of the surprising things, and I think we'll talk about this in a second, is that's actually quite similar to how Darwin, I don't think consciously, but unconsciously thought about his own mechanism, about natural selection, to the point that there are occasions where Darwin will use language like final causation, which is another term for teleology, as an explanation. That
Mm.
even people like Thomas Huxley saw natural selection not as getting rid of purposes and goals. He called it a reconciliation between mechanistic causation and teleological explanations. So all of a sudden, all the pieces started to come together in my head of saying, what if the reason we're having such a problem with fitness, trying to define fitness, is we no longer think about it the same way Darwin and the early Darwinists did? And the more you begin to think about it their way, the
Mm,
more you're beginning to think like a classical Christian. Even obviously, I'm not saying Huxley or Darwin were. I'm saying the more you're beginning to think like them. And the more you begin to introduce this mental causation into the Darwinian process. So that's broadly what I'm saying. I can keep going, but it's your call.
no, that's fascinating. And yeah, you can actually, if you want to, get into the history of that, because I feel like a lot of people, Christian and otherwise, like champion this sort of atheistic, if you will, evolutionary theory that supposedly Darwin proposed, and it is like this defeat of religion or something like that.
Yeah.
So expanding on the history of the understanding of evolution in light of teleology might actually be helpful, and it grounds your view like in the early
Yeah.
history and thought process rather than this like cuckoo idea. You know what I
Sure.
mean?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note that in the first 100 years of Darwinism, give or take, that viewing Darwinism as a teleological process, as having some sort of goal orientation built into that, it was a very common view. I can't make any sort of pronouncements on like, is it the dominant view? But even like the founders of what's called the modern synthesis, the or what's sometimes called neo-Darwinism, many of them thought Darwinism had a teleology to it. I talk about this in my full thesis. I don't in the article I sent you. But George Gaylord Simpson, Theodosius Dobzhansky, there's quite a few of them that were fully on board with reading Darwinism and even saying quite explicitly, has teleology in it. So the idea that Darwinism is purely random, that it can't have purpose to it, that's actually quite a modern idea that even the founders of Darwinian theory themselves wouldn't have agreed with. And
Mm,
actually, my point is I don't think it even works without it. So if we're going to go into the history and look at that, the reason I think that we're even having this issue to begin with, and why I think it's actually arisen in the past 50 years, is because for the first 100 years of Darwinism, a teleological reading of Darwinism, there's many different degrees to it. Some went quite extreme, some were quite reserved. But nevertheless, there was some level of that, and they didn't have the same issues that we're dealing with over the past 50 years.
mm,
That's again
gotcha.
very broad brushstrokes.
Right.
Yeah, but that's broadly the history of it. Is historically, if you read early reception of Darwin's history, there wasn't a lot of questioning of whether or not you could fit it into a view of the cosmos that was teleological, a theistic view of the cosmos. Of course, we as theists believes that the universe has a purpose, a goal, that God is guiding it. There wasn't a lot of questioning of that. People like B.B. Warfield, one of
Mm,
the founders of the fundamentalist movement, was quite okay with the idea of Darwinism being seen as a teleological process. And quite a few of Darwin's earliest defenders were evangelicals. I wrote an article for Christianity Today that you can look up. A couple articles, in fact, looking at Britain and the United States of some of these earliest defenders of Darwinism. And they were evangelicals, often seen as an ally for the Christian faith.
mm. Gotcha. Yeah, that's fascinating, and I'm really appreciate that you have talked about it here. You've talked about it elsewhere. I know in the writings I've done on
Yeah.
theistic evolution, I cited the video you did with the YouTube channel "What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You."
Hmm.
And there you were talking about some of the history of the acceptance of evolution by Christians in the 1800s. Like as soon as it's there, you have Christians who are on board with it, and a lot of
Right.
Christians. Like it's not an
Yeah.
insignificant number, and so it's cool because like people think that it's always been like at odds, but people just don't know the history,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Absolutely.
so uh, it seems though that for anyone who maybe has different views of God or is not religious, like they can't really accept that evolution or fitness is going to have a teleology to it because, of course, they would be oriented towards God or the divine or something
Yeah.
like that. And so, what evidence is there of a teleology, or does it need to be assumed into the framework in order for it to like
Yeah.
manifest.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it gets
Mm-hmm.
right at the part that we kind of left off on, which
Mm-hmm.
is how I suggested that teleology solves the issue of fitness, but how? So this is
Mm-hmm.
what I'm going to say. When Darwin looked at fitness and when he conceptualized this, how organisms outcompete other organisms, he thought in a very teleological manner, and he's overt in certain places like this, that he thought organisms themselves had goals. They're oriented towards certain things, and there's nearly a sort of layering of higher and lower order goals, where reproduction is the sort of highest goal. Survival is a means towards reproduction. An organism can survive and be the best survivor ever, but if it doesn't reproduce, it's going to be wiped out of the population. So survival becomes a means towards reproduction. And then you have your certain developmental processes and functional traits that help you survive and therefore reproduce. So there's this layer ordering where like your developmental and functional traits help you survive. Your survival helps you to then reproduce, live long enough to reproduce. And as if everything's working in a right teleological ordering, your functional traits are for the sake of, they have the purpose of survival. Survival has the purpose of allowing for propagation, reproduction. Then everything's working in the right order. There's a teleological ordering here. And when your functional traits and developmental processes achieve those later two aims better, when they allow you to survive and reproduce better, they therefore are serving their purpose. Notice the language there. They're serving their purpose better. They're arriving at their aims. They are there because they have function. Darwin thought functionally. He thought of these traits as having goals, and they are being selected by their ability to achieve these goals. And that is the framework that he was operating under. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
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 It's not super radical. You read any intro to biology book, quite often they'll use this language that, like wings are for the sake of flying. If the wing isn't as good at flying as other wings, it will be outcompeted. But it slips in this teleological language. So much so that people who oppose it call it the menace. I've read articles from Cambridge biologists who call teleology a menace that just keeps reappearing. It's nearly impossible to talk about traits without talking about their goal, what they're there for. And I get into like what are we to do with that? But fundamentally, if we're just going to think historically, that is the conceptual framework that Darwin was operating under. So now let's apply this to the problem of fitness. If Darwin thought of fitness as the capacity of traits to fulfill survival and reproduction, what does that do to the problem? Well, this teleological definition of fitness, it avoids the problem of nominalism because it actually gives us something that all these traits share in common. They all have the same telos, survival and reproduction. So now all of a sudden, it's not just, you're not looking at the physical traits like the white fur or the sharp teeth and all these things and trying to say what they have in common. What they have in common is they have the same goal. You stop looking at the mechanistic cause and start looking at the teleological cause. And now all of a sudden it becomes a sort of unified causal explanation. They all have the same, they share a property in common, which is the same goal. So we can now treat fitness as a unified causal mechanism. But the unity doesn't come from any sort of physical unity. So for instance, to give you an analogy from fitness, gravity is gravity because let's say gravitons are causing us. So there's a same physical thing causing the same effect. Well, the unity in natural selection, we don't have that same physical thing. It's different in every single instance of a selection event. The unity is in the fact that they all have the same goal. That's the way Darwin thought, and that's filtered into how we even think of natural selection to this day. How biologists think about that is that fitness, the goal traits have increased fitness because of their goal orientation. They're all for the sake of survival and reproduction. So that's what we need to understand first. So it avoids the problem of nominalism. It also avoids the problem of tautology because now all of a sudden it's not survival of the fittest becomes survival of the survivors. It's certain traits are oriented towards survival, which all things being equal will often result in survival. The ability to do that, it doesn't always happen because sometimes randomness gets in the way. An avalanche might bury the stronger lions sometimes, right? just by random chance. So it's not tautological. These are two separate things. Saying you're oriented towards, that you have traits that are better oriented towards survival and reproduction than other populations or members of within your population doesn't guarantee that you then survive. So it avoids tautology. We're talking about two separate things here. The traits oriented towards survival and reproduction and the actual achievement of survival and reproduction. So it avoids the problem of tautology itself as well. So we avoid the twin horns of the dilemma. If we treat fitness as a teleological concept, like Darwin himself did, then all of a sudden we have a coherent concept that gives us everything we want from a theory of natural selection. And honestly, this is, if you think that this is, I'm off on my own doing something very weird here, something I draw attention to, and I believe it's in that paper as well, are a group of philosophers called the statisticalists. And I know a couple of their leaders well. They're great, great people. But what they say, what these scholars say, is the problem of fitness and natural selection has plagued us for 50 years. Therefore, we need to get rid of the idea that natural selection is a cause of evolution. We need to do away with it. Natural selection is not a cause of evolution. There's no way to conceptually make sense of it. And therefore, we need to get rid of it. And unsurprisingly, they're not super popular.
Right.
Biologists revolt quite often against that idea. No, of course, natural select. Like, we're using this all the time in our theories. Of course it is. And so if we want to avoid, with this, the very interesting thing here is, if we want to actually avoid statisticalism, if we want to avoid saying that natural selection isn't a cause of evolution, then I think we have to adopt a teleological framework. And so to sort of look ahead 4 or 5 steps, I actually think the theist can accept Darwinism, and the atheist is the one that has a problem with it. Because the theist can say, yes, I believe that things are teleological. I think that there are real purposes and goals in the world. Therefore, I can accept that fitness is a real causal mechanism. It's the atheist that I think is going to have to be driven into something like statisticalism. And honestly, I think you even see this. There's a book by Jerry Fodor and Massimo Piatelli Palmarini. It's a very misunderstood book called What Darwin Got Wrong. And they start the book by talking about how staunch atheists they are. And then they basically say there's no way of thinking about natural selection that isn't teleological. Therefore, atheists should not believe in evolution or Darwinian evolution. Jerry Fodor is one of the most important philosophers of the past century. This is not a nobody saying this. And Piatelli Palmarini is got a man who does a lot of stuff in cognitive biology. So they know what they're talking about. They know what they're talking about. So again, I'm not the only one saying this. A lot of people, this is this is shocking to a lot of people to where they don't believe me. And yet this is something that as soon as you familiarize yourself with the literature, it starts popping up everywhere. And there's another one. David Henke is a biologist. He was out of Cambridge, who wrote an article where he basically full on says, we just have to accept that natural selection is just a tautology. It doesn't explain anything. It's not a real cause. But we have to do that so we don't have teleology.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, question obviously related to everything. If the teleology, if the goal is survival and reproduction, then it doesn't seem like you need God as an explanation. Yeah. And so how does the say atheism,
where does God come from?
Yeah. Right. And how does atheism have a problem with a teleology if the goal is survival and fitness, whereas the theist wouldn't?
That's a very perceptive question, because this is, if you think about this as a syllogism, I've only presented one premise. And you're saying, well, what about the other premise? So what we might say is premise 1, if natural teleology exists, then God is the best explanation of natural teleology. Number 2, natural teleology exists. Therefore, the best explanation is God, right? I have defended premise 2, that natural teleology exists. We need it for a good understanding of Darwinism. But I haven't defended premise 1, that God is the best explanation for it. And it sounds like that's exactly what your question is hammering home. Well, why? I mean, yeah, okay, organisms have goals and ends and stuff like that, but why does God have to be the explanation of that? Well, let me put it this way. This gets into a very complex metaphysical problem that might take an hour to explain, but I found a way to explain it in a lot shorter time. Let's say I have an acorn. What species does this acorn belong to? Let's say an oak tree, right? It belongs to an oak tree, right? But outside my window, there's an oak tree, and this isn't what an oak tree looks like. Oak trees look like that, right? Oak trees look like that. But what you'd say is, okay, there's some physical differences to it, right? But ultimately, this will become an oak tree. Right. If I plant this in the ground, it'll become an oak tree. Well, actually, the vast majority of acorns don't become oak trees. They get eaten by squirrels. They have, they'll die. The vast majority don't. And yet, if you open a science book and say, what is the lifestyle of an oak tree? You don't get that acorns getting eaten by squirrels. They're there for the sake of feeding squirrels. No, there's a goal orientation. Acorns are there to become oak trees. In our biology, we have this idea of goal orientation. Now, here's the thing. If somehow this acorn points towards the oak tree, how do I know that? There's nothing in the acorn physically that points towards the oak tree. There's no physical property that tells me this is here for the sake of becoming an oak tree. It is a non-physical property. Teleology is a non-physical property. Anytime you use the word ought, this is meant or purpose or goal, you're applying something that's not true about that physically in the moment. You're applying something non-physical to it. That's why I said earlier on that teleology is a mental property. It is a mental property. So acorns don't have minds. In theory, I hope not. They don't have minds, right? So where does this mental property come from? And this is where the big issue comes in.
Oh, gotcha.
It is a non-physical property, a mental property inscribed into the very conceptual reality of evolution.
And so we have all of these physical creatures or things with non-mental, without a mind, right? Yeah. That still have non-physical properties or elements to them.
Exactly. As soon as you say they have a certain fitness level, that if it's teleological, it's non-physical, right? When you say that, the lion has these properties of being bigger and stronger for the sake of survival and reproduction. Well, maybe that lion didn't survive and reproduce well. Well, they were there for the sake of that, right? The physical reality might be different from what it's supposed to do. So it's something non-physical. That fitness property is something non-physical about it. Because we're describing what it's there for, whether or not it actually realizes that property. And it's actually that conceptual, if you ever heard of genetic drift or drift events in biology, the very conceptual distinction, drift is usually how we allow for randomness in the process of evolution. That's exactly, like drift allows for randomness, whereas natural selection is the more predictable things. So like maybe the bigger, stronger lion population just happens to be in a mountain that, be migrating through a mountain. The first less fit population got through fine. The second one, an avalanche came and killed them all. Well, they didn't die because they were less fit. They died because just by happenstance, the avalanche happened when they were crossing rather than the other population. So drift allows us to import randomness into it. Now, but there's a problem there, right? Because now all of a sudden, like fitness, the fitness itself, it was supposed to allow for greater survival and reproduction, but it didn't. The physical reality is distinct from what the fitness was pointing towards. So we've got two different things here. What ought to have happened, it normally or ought to have happened, versus what actually did happen. So fitness is talking about things that are not purely physical. It tells us more than what physically actually happened. It tells us this lion population, it should have outcompeted in this other lion population, but it didn't because of random chance. So we're actually making this sort of distinction all the time, these non-physical distinctions all the time in biology. And that is the foundation for the distinction between genetic drift and biological fitness and natural selection.
Gotcha. And so that's where God and even Christian theology and like even I would say biblical studies even, it sounds like, can be helpful here because many people have noted, many scholars have noted that like Genesis is trying to tell us that God gave function, right, to the universe, and that
Yes.
right, God gives, right, the image of God to humans, but like at creation it's expected to be fruitful and multiply, right?
Yeah.
So creation is expected within a Christian framework to have function, have goals, have purposes, and even specifically to survive and reproduce.
Yeah.
Whereas under a atheistic framework, that, or at least a purely naturalistic framework, they wouldn't have a explanation for the function, for the non-physical properties that we see in fitness.
Yeah, and from a purely naturalistic framework, teleology does not make a lot of sense on a purely naturalistic framework because you can't appeal to anything physical, or I should say naturalistic or physicalist. There's different definitions of what the parameters of naturalism are. I don't want to get into that. But you know, when it comes to a physicalist perspective, teleology is not physical. So if there is a real one instance of real teleology across the entire universe, it, in my opinion, acts as a disproof of physicalism.
And so it would act as a disproof of physicalism, but a lot of atheists like aren't physicalists. Like
Mm-hmm.
they will, right, accept that.
Right.
And so um do they specifically need God for a teleology, or do you think they could attempt to account for things so long as they're not a
Yeah.
physicalist?
There's a whole host of this, and I actually devote a chapter. There will be a chapter in my final book on this devoted to atheistic alternatives, because I don't think atheists don't have to be naturalists. There
Yeah.
are atheists who are panpsychists. There are atheists who believe in emergent properties,
Hmm.
emergent non-physical properties. Um, and we can really get into the the nitty gritty of some of these deeper metaphysical issues.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, I'm pretty unconvinced that even if these are possible explanations, I'm not sure they're more plausible explanations. And here's
Gotcha.
the reason. And here's the reason why. I think panpsychism makes best sense on theism.
Mm.
I think
For the
panpsychism.
audience, what is panpsychism?
Yeah, sure. So panpsychism or neutral monism, panpsychism or neutral monism is the view that all of reality has a physical side and a mental side. So imagine it's two sides of the same coin. I might be looking at the physical side to this computer, to you. I'm seeing the physical side. That's sort of external side. But hidden from our view is the other side of the coin, which is the mental side, which everything has a mental side. The only one thing that I have access to, the mental side, is my own because it's sort of interior to me. Like that's the side that I have. But subjectivity, consciousness, is a universal property of everything. Now, it doesn't mean that there's maybe a global mind out there, like anima mundi, if you know your Platonic philosophy, a world
Mm.
mind. Some believe in that, some don't, right? But if you in any way think that reality has like two aspects to it, two sides of the coin, a mental and a physical, then you're broadly speaking a panpsychist or neutral monist.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
So there are atheists who are panpsychists, but even
Yeah.
that wouldn't necessarily be able to account for things, or at least God would be more plausible.
Yeah, so I think I
Yeah.
think I think theism solves a lot of issues that you don't
Hmm.
get with atheistic panpsychism. Let me just pick on that one because that one's really popular right now. Atheistic panpsychism believes that there are mental things, so there are purposes and goals, right? But it actually there's an explanatory strata that's left out, which is why do things have the purposes that they do?
Mm.
So, yes, you can say, yes, purposes and mind are built into the very fabric of reality. Okay, but why do they have the purposes that they do have?
Mm.
And that nearly needs to be left as a brute fact. And brute
Mm.
facts, I think everyone's sort of bottoms out in brute facts, but you want to avoid them as much as you can to avoid arbitrariness. And I think so. Theism has explanatory scope. Um, it can explain things that atheistic panpsychism doesn't. I also think it can solve the combination problem. And this gets into some deep metaphysics. I would challenge readers to read Michael and Joanna Leidenhog's stuff. They do a lot of stuff on panpsychism and theism. But the combination problem is this idea of okay, so every individual one of my atoms has a sort of like very small mind, like I mean, not like a full mind like I do, but a sort of basic mind. Well, when you combine them all together into me, all of a sudden, all these little minds form one big mind, which is me. Now, all of a sudden, it's not a trillion small minds; it's one giant mind. How does that happen? That's called the
Mm.
combination problem in panpsychism. How does a unified mind like mine arise out of the combination of all these smaller little minds? Well, I think when theism, that you have a very ready and easy explanation for it, which is that the mental this gets into deep classical metaphysics, but I think that the mental property is not a property primarily of the atoms themselves, as if it's inscribed into them. It's a donation from the consciousness of God, what's called a participatory ontology. So that when God recognizes certain substances, certain things, he recognizes them as units and thus grants them a unified mind. So I think like this is why I appeal to Thomas Aquinas. I think Thomas Aquinas had a view that you could make sense of on panpsychism. I'm not calling him a panpsychist,
Mm.
but you could reconcile with, and you wouldn't have that problem of the combination problem. So again, there's a lot more things like that that we can really dive into. But ultimately, I think that even if atheistic panpsychism is a possible option, it's not the most plausible option, and therefore this can serve as an apologetic.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So two other questions, at least related to acceptance. So, uh, as I made a video saying, "Hey, I'm doing this," and as I promoted this live stream, there were people who were seemingly concerned about like anti-science rhetoric, right, and that
Yeah.
sort of thing. But what it sounds like from the stream, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and you can bounce off of this, but what it sounds like is that there is no science denial happening.
No.
You're addressing a philosophical problem that occurs in science that philosophers of science are also struggling with, and you're trying to solve that. And so
If
you're doing something different than I think a lot of, say, atheists are concerned about.
if anything, I'm trying to rescue problematic elements of science. I mean,
Mm,
think about it. Think about what the statisticalists are basically saying we have to do. We have to deny that natural selection is a cause, and yet that is foundational for how many thousands of articles in biological journals.
right.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we can reconceptualize that. I'm not saying that it's not impossible not to reconceptualize it, but at the end of the day, I'm a scientific conservative. I'm trying
Mm,
to keep I'm trying to retain what biology has normally and typically how it normally and typically treats fitness. So it's actually
mm,
I'm trying to save I'm a conservative. I'm trying to save how we understand fitness. And I'm just basically saying this is the method for doing it. This is, you might have to bite the bullet and stop being anti-teleological, but there's not a single aspect of science I'm denying. And a whole lot that I'm saying you might have to if you don't accept my conclusions.
gotcha. Gotcha. And on the other side, though, some Christians are going to be skeptical. Some may reject this Thomistic understanding. Others are going to
Sure.
have different concepts of God. Others are going to reject evolution entirely. Do you think there are
Yeah.
strong or good or valid Christian objections to your view? And how would you help get Christians on board with your perspective with theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism?
Yeah.
Which one you want to use?
I'll give you two. One is from two objections that I've gotten. One is from Marcus Ross, the paleontologist who's a young Earth creationist,
Yes. Yeah.
and the other is from Paul Copan. Um,
Okay.
both of which I've talked to this idea about. Copan actually attended a lecture where I presented this idea many moons ago.
Mm.
Um, Marcus Ross, does this idea have any benefit for the young Earth creationists? The answer is yes.
Hmm.
Because let me ask you this. I mean, you've interviewed these people. Does Marcus Ross, do Ken Ham, do they accept the reality of natural selection?
No,
They do. No, they do.
they do.
They they don't think evolution like what they call macroevolution. We can get into
Oh,
that.
yeah, that's right. But they accept
But
microevolution.
they do. Yeah, and
And
they think
yeah, yeah, yeah,
they are 100% on board that
yeah.
natural selection is a real thing. They just don't think it can create sort of evolution between kinds. is usually the language
Yeah.
that's used. Evolution. But within a kind, they think natural selection explains why a polar bear is different from a brown bear. Go read the answer books. I have one over there. I can point to you in the page where they talk about we accept natural selection.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because and so here's the thing. If what I am saying is right, even the young earth creationists can use it. And it actually gets past origin debates. Because if you're a young earth creationist, you're hearing this, I want you to hear this as an ally to where you don't now no longer have to, or you don't at least don't have to, like you have an option not to talk about how old the earth is or missing links or something like that. What you can then do is say, hey, we both agree that natural selection is a thing, even if we
Mm,
disagree to the extent it gives us, right? You can just say, okay, well, where does this natural selection come from? You can find a common ground now with your evolutionary opponent, whether they're Christian or non-Christian. Well, Christians will agree with you, right? But with your non-Christian atheistic opponent, and say, hey, look, we agree that there is such a thing as natural selection. I think that the best way of explaining natural selection is theism. So this is a valuable
gotcha.
resource to you, regardless of how you interpret the first two chapters of Genesis.
Gotcha.
That's the first one. That's Marcus
Mm-hmm.
Ross. Number two, I have relied upon, I've been overt, a classical theistic framework.
Mm-hmm.
Many Christian philosophers, if not most, are not classical theists.
Mm.
Now, this is a big debate, right? You know, how much can we rely on this? And then, so this is what Paul Copan asked me, because I don't believe he is a classical theist. He says, can non-classical theists use your argument? And again, the answer is yes. They will frame it slightly differently. But what I would point them to is in Alvin Plantinga's book, Warrant and Proper Function, where he makes a sort of, it's a slightly different angle, but he basically makes a similar argument that if there is such a thing as proper functionality, its best explanation is theism. He sort of doesn't really develop this out too much, but nevertheless sort of throws this out there. And I think that that would be the way that a non-classical theist could use this argument in the exact same way. They develop that first premise. If there is natural teleology, then it points to God. They would develop it differently than that. But I would
Mm.
point them in the direction of Alvin Plantinga's Warrant and Proper Function in order to do that.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I was thinking there of like neoclassical theists, right? Like there's process theology and open theism,
Yeah,
right? So yeah, it would be
it's
interesting to
compatible with all.
see.
hmm
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how they develop those.
Yeah, and I
Um,
don't think it's that tough. It would just take a little work updating and adapting Alvin Plantinga's work to that.
gotcha. So, what are some of the theological implications of this understanding? So, how does
Yeah,
God interact with evolution? Is he causing creatures to evolve certain traits so that they can survive? Like, what's going
right.
on here?
What do you mean by cause, right? Because we talked about two different causes, right? Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so what is implications? Okay, let's broad scale, big picture. I do affirm evolution. So I'm going to treat it like this. Nevertheless, I think that something even similar on young Earth creationists can be adapted to this because there is still a small degree of evolution. You can adapt this to see how God interacts in that small scale evolution that even young Earth creationists accept. So, but I'm going to treat this like someone who wants to accept evolution writ large. Okay. I think this gives us a model for understanding how God is causally involved in the universe. I think I have one advantage on ID theorists. And Stephen Meyer and I have had quite a few discussions about this. I know we have.
ID being intelligent design.
Yeah, sorry, intelligent design.
Gotcha.
Intelligent design theorists have to point at particular places and says that's what God did.
Mm-hmm.
What about the rest? Was he not involved? Was he not creatively involved in that? Well, maybe. You have to then come with another theory about how God might have been involved. But really, they're pointing out and isolating certain instances of irreducible complexity or specified complexity and saying that's the locus of God's causal activity.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true for other theories of theistic evolution. They might say, well, God caused, like we can't detect it, but maybe God caused this mutation to occur so that it would propagate in the environment and he could guide evolution that way. The biggest problem that I have with both of those views is that's not how Christians have classically understood God's interaction with the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And this was actually some of the early Christian interaction with evolution saw evolution as a good because, and I quote, either God is involved with all of creation or he's not involved with any of it.
Mm.
We should stop trying to pick places out where we say, this is where God's involved and this is where he's not. My view allows me to say God is involved with all of evolution, because all of evolution implies teleology. It's fundamental to the very concept of Darwinism. Therefore, God is involved with all of evolution, because teleology derives from God. So it provides a ubiquitous model to see. Actually, here's the fun thing: goal orientation. I'm going to get a little theological if I have time. I don't want to take up too much time.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
How Thomas Aquinas and how the classical theologians understood teleology is we are all motivated by certain things they call goods. And I spent a whole chapter in my dissertation in the upcoming book on good. It's the first chapter. You need to understand what a good is. And what they understood a good as, it's very complex. Again, I devote 16,000 words to this. It's a complex thing. But ultimately, the thought was final causation is always, teleology is always driven towards certain things we perceive as goods. In other words, natural selection, it develops good traits for the organisms. What I mean by good traits, it promotes survival and reproduction. Survival and reproduction are good for the organism. Should be pretty basic. Of course they are. Me getting up to get a coffee because I'm thirsty, because not being thirsty is a good for me. Drinking liquids is a good for me, right? Teleology, the goal orientation is always driven towards certain goods. And that's that concept of goods that I think atheistic panpsychism is missing. So go reflecting all the way back to that. So we need a concept of the good with a capital G. In two classical Christians, that good was God. He did not merely have goodness. Like in the same way, like a sandwich might have goodness for me. God just simply was goodness itself.
Mm-hmm.
He was goodness itself. And all finite goods are mere participations, like little droplets within the ocean of the infinite goodness that is God, that we all get to participate in. What that means then is everything I strive towards, every good that I go after, what my heart fundamentally wants is God himself.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't really want a finite good. I want goodness itself. God is the final goal towards which all creation, including every action that I do, all of creation strives. Now put that into perspective of evolution. With taking every little bit of science, if we just change our understanding of fitness one bit, not only do we solve a problem in the philosophy of biology, but now all of a sudden we have a vision of evolution as a giant universal process of all of creation, all of life striving after its creator. And what's beautiful about that is that reinterprets how we see everything in biology. There's these wonderful things called evolutionary landscapes. Evolutionary landscapes is where you might have fitness peaks, where basically they create what looks like a hills and valleys. And at the very top are the highest fitness. And what you can do is map a population, and as time goes on, it will try and get to the top of these peaks. But maybe the environment will change and that won't be fit anymore, so that drops down. So then the organism will move up to this other peak, right? And that's how natural selection works. You can actually visualize this as evolutionary landscapes, to where organisms are trying to ascend up these peaks. And that's a beautiful image. That's a beautiful image. If you understand this in the way I'm saying, that's a beautiful image of organisms striving after the goodness and the good in itself, striving after God, greater and greater participation in the goodness that God offers us. And that, to me, if you want to talk about a theology of evolution, one that just doesn't say, well, maybe then God added this, maybe God had a purpose for this. This is a vision of the evolutionary process that mirrors our own evolutionary development. In other words, like my whole life is an attempt to more and more participate in the goodness God offers me, to more and more strive upward and further inward, to shamelessly steal from C.S. Lewis for my own purposes here, in the goodness of God, to participate in him, in the divine nature, more and more, to quote Peter. And that is exactly the same thing we see on a grander scale with every life form out there. That is a theological vision that I think we as Christians should bring to the evolutionary process. And it's something that I think my framework can provide.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And so, how does this? I don't know how much, like, how specific this question is, but like, how does this participation like work out practically? Because like, it's easy, at least like conceptually in my head. And as I was interviewing someone a while back on intelligent design, which is also a live stream you guys can check out. Like you mentioned, they were able to point to specific things and say God seemed to have done that
Yeah.
because X, Y, and Z scientifically. Um, and you want to make a overarching framework for all of
Hmm.
reality, everything that we're seeing physically, which is great. But like, practically, when a new trait shows up and a new species, however you want to define species, emerges, um, is it to that teleological end as well? Are they ultimately seeking the goodness of God? uh
What?
you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah. So let's divide between variation and natural selection, right? When a new trait arises, we can still say maybe God did put in that trait. I have no qualm with saying that. My problem is whenever our model of God's interaction with evolution ends with that.
Hmm.
Because that's remember, there's variation and natural selection, right? Darwin is dealing with natural selection, and he left open where variation came from. So because Darwin is thought to be a purely naturalistic explanation, a lot of theists said, well, now we have to plug in God at the level of variation. And that's
Hmm.
where a lot of the conversation is. And natural selection's been left alone. And I'm saying, no, it's actually at the level of natural selection that we need to see God's interaction with the universe.
Gotcha.
I'm leaving alone, actually, the other part where variation comes in. Maybe God does. Maybe God did miraculously, throw in, maybe the Cambrian explosion, God miraculously introduced a lot of genetic variety or new species or something like that. Maybe. I'm not going to say yes. I'm not going to say no. My point is that we shouldn't, as theologians, locate that and think that's the place where primarily we need to see God's interaction with his creation. I want to be able to say God has been interacting with it all along, wooing all of creation towards a greater participation in him.
Gotcha. And so, one last question on this theological point for my own clarity and intrigue and nerdiness.
It's yeah. It's
Uh,
complex, and I've given to you about 300 pages worth of
yeah,
information in
that's
just
fair.
over an hour.
Yeah. Have you thought about God's presence in relation to all of this? Because another framework that has been proposed for understanding evolution theologically is noting God's omnipresence, and even going so far as to propose fancy term incoming, but panentheism,
Panentheism, yeah.
and things like that. And so, have you thought about it at all? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I've worked a little bit with panentheism, especially I worked with a figure called Goethe. Goethe was he's mostly known as a poet, but he actually did some early scientific work. He actually invented the field of comparative morphology, discovered the human intermaxillary bone. Darwin lists him and credits him as with some of his early, helping to inspire some early ideas of
Mm,
evolution. Well, I think that he was a panentheist, and he had a very interesting theological view. So I have interacted with this some. All this to say is that the word panentheism is terribly defined.
that is fair.
Yeah, it is horribly defined. Um, what's funny to me is people like Christopher Knight will argue that the Eastern Orthodox have a panentheistic model, but other theologians, Eastern Orthodox theologians, go, no, we don't. And when with my ear to the ground of this conversation, it seems like they're not actually arguing about concepts. They're arguing about whether the word should be applied. They actually agree conceptually. They just don't like the word.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of the issue is panentheism. Well, what do we mean by that? And Ryan Mullins has actually written an article on this where
Mm,
the entire beginning of the article is the problem of defining panentheism as its own sort of separate category. Well, if we look at the word itself, pan, all, in, theism, all in God.
hmm
Well, all Christians are panentheists by that definition, unless you deny Acts 17. In him we live and move and have our being.
Right.
In God, all in God, we live and move and have our being. But that's not, I mean, okay, so all Christians that's not a very useful term then, right? We want to say it's like separate from, say, classical theistic models. So
Mm,
normally, how panentheism is portrayed. The most prominent model you'll see thrown out there, though not everyone, is that it thinks about the universe on the model of the body of God. That God
Mm.
is a sort of animating spirit, separate from the universe, but animating everything within the universe. So
Mm-hmm.
that the universe could sort of pass away, but God's still going to be there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's in the same way that like I might pass away, but maybe my soul will fly off to I'll fly away, oh glory, right? Um, and so that's the model you'll see bandied about is this sort of soul body model of God in the universe. Now, I don't like that one in particular. Um, and it's just because I think that the classical theistic model of Thomas Aquinas is a little bit more intellectually robust.
Mm.
And this is going to get us to some really abstract points of theology. But what I would point people to is I think a participatory ontology. Andrew Davison, who is a theologian out of Oxford, has written a book length treatment of participation. So I'd recommend your users go to that. He's actually also has a PhD in biochemistry. Um,
Nice.
yeah, as well as a theologian. So he's done a lot of work in science and theology as well.
Mm.
Now, all that to say is go check that out. I think that's a better method for understanding the God world relationship than the soul body model.
Mm. Gotcha. Interesting. And so, one last question, again related to this. If like based on like the etymology of the word, right, we're all like technically panentheists unless we deny, right, Acts 17.
Well,
Um,
well, yeah. I mean, no, I don't think anyone defines it that broadly, but I kind of pointed out that like the word itself, right? Yes, but yeah, I see what you're saying, right?
right. And so, under that, like God is sort of present in all because all is sort of
Present within
exists in
him.
him
Yeah.
in some sense, right? Um, do you think that could also be developed and work out in a evolutionary framework? Or do you think that this also too
Yeah.
relates to teleology?
Yeah, I mean, you could have a I mean, a lot of the early people who were working in science and theology were panentheists. That was nearly a majority report of the early people who
Mm,
started these conversations. I think you could, but I think it's also important to note that you'd probably want to, if you are a panentheist and you're really drawn to that, I think you'd probably want to work it out in the same way that Alvin Plantinga does. It's not a classical form of theology. At least is how people usually try and differentiate classical theism from panentheism.
gotcha.
They usually
Hmm.
want to treat that as something different. Um, so because of that, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, how would you develop my model? I would say that first premise, if God exists, or sorry, if natural teleology exists, then God is the best explanation. I think you should best develop it through the idea of proper functionality, like Alvin
Mm,
Plantinga thought of it. All that to be said, again, I'm not a huge fan of most models of panentheism. I think
yeah.
I think they are particularly modern, and I don't mean that in a good sense.
Mm,
Um, I think they try and view causation through the lens of modern day science rather than through we kind of brought up Aristotle.
yeah.
I think Aristotle's view of causation is a lot more helpful um, in when we're talking about this sort of stuff than more modern conceptions of causation.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I know you had to struggle to do this because you were in a meeting. They had to bring your stuff over.
Yeah, starting a new job, and there has been a lot of meetings, and sometimes they run over. So I appreciate everyone's patience. I appreciate your patience a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of sat here and was like, well, I know he's going to be here. So if I just talk a lot, which I'm not bad at, I can, we'll be fine. So,
I appreciate
um,
that.
yeah, but thank you so much for doing this. Do you have any concluding thoughts? Where can people find your material
Yeah,
to see this developed out? What can we expect from you on these subjects in the future?
absolutely. So this is published in this wonderful journal. I said it's a Catholic journal. I am not Catholic, but trust me, anytime you talk about Thomas Aquinas, the Catholics tend to be more
I
apt
do
to hear it.
quick mention. I do have a link to that in the description so people can go check it out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. You
Hmm.
can listen to me on the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. I host that. It's much more irreverent than I've been here. I get to let let my tie down a little bit in that one. So I co-host that with a philosopher named Jonathan Lionheart, and we just tackle the most, interesting, crazy stuff that you're afraid to ask your pastor is sort of the byline that we operate under. So we're doing a
Hmm.
series now on different views of hell. So we've
Mm.
had on Jordan Wood, James Dominic Rooney, the philosopher. So we're going through that now. So go check that out if you want more from me. I have an academia.edu page
Quick
where I've got
question on
all.
the health subject. Are you guys gonna have Chris Date on at some point?
We have had Chris State. We have
Okay.
already. So no. So if you go back in our archives, we did have him come on and do. It's a phenomenal episode where
Mm.
he begins by saying, first off, I just want to say I'm a young Earth creationist. That's how literally I take Scripture. Second off, I'm an
Mm.
annihilationist. Hell is not a place where you're eternally consciously tormented forever. And then
Mm.
just defends it biblically. And it sounds like you probably had him on your show.
No, I would like to though. He is what kind of convinced me to fall on that side, and I think it solved a lot of the problems. It's also great because, um, from what I can tell, when I've tried to interact with a lot of like non-Christians on the topic, they're just not aware of what it is, which is partly Christians' fault, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the one that like traumatizes a lot of
Yeah.
people is the eternal conscious torment
It
view.
is the historic view, though. Yeah. So.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I think he's right, and his view would be,
Mm.
I think, a lot better for a bunch of different
Well,
reasons. But yeah.
so we did have R. Zachary Manis, who takes what's called the divine presence model, which is closer to the traditional model.
Mm.
He did say on our podcast, this is from a while ago, it's our second hell series,
Mm.
that he thinks annihilationists have the best scriptural support. Last episode,
Yeah.
we had Jordan Wood, who is a universalist, that everyone gets into heaven eventually.
Mhm.
He came on and also said he thought annihilationists have the best scriptural support.
I
So
have seen this so much where there'd be like hell, eternal conscious torment is the traditional view, annihilationism has the best biblical support, and universalism is the best philosophically robust. I would like someone to change this and make annihilationism also philosophically robust, but yeah, that's what I've heard too.
I think there's a good philosophical case for it. We don't have to get into that, but go
Yeah,
check that out.
yeah.
I have an academia.edu page. I've got most of my publications. This book, this dissertation, if you have access to e-theses, you can find it. Otherwise, email me. You can find my email at academia.edu or bother this guy. He's got it. Um,
Yeah.
he says he really likes getting messages at 3 a.m. He said that before in a conversation. But
Totally.
this will probably find a life in a publisher soon. I'm in conversations with a few, and I don't want to speak too soon, but at some point it will. So
Gotcha.
it's a process.
I'm hoping. I'm hoping. I think a lot of people could benefit from it. Like, if nothing else, like we need, you know, I think you and I both agree, we need more scientifically literate Christians, and who aren't necessarily like using scripture to sort of justify maybe like certain denials of evolution and stuff like that. And so if we can fit things in a Christian framework that works with scripture and philosophy and all of that, then that's great.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think to toot my own horn a little bit, I will say so. Andrew Davison, who I brought up earlier, he's the
Hmm.
Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford, who probably, I would say, arguably the highest position in theology in the UK.
Hmm.
Where he has to have personal contact with the king on the state of theology.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
that's
Um,
crazy.
he also has, again, a PhD in biophysics. He was my external examiner for this dissertation last year.
Mm.
And one of the most encouraging things he said to me, and an encouragement for you to take these ideas seriously and go check them out, hopefully, is the thanks that this is an idea that could revolutionize the field. He told me that in the defense. So,
Mm.
and this is a guy, again, has a PhD in biochemistry. I've talked to plenty of scientists who are on board. Gart, if you know him, he's been a big
Mm.
guest on Capturing Christianity.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm a good friend of his. He loves this idea. He thinks it's phenomenal. So it's been very, very encouraging to be able to talk to scientists, especially scientists who are theologically trained, who basically think that this can really help revolutionize how we have this conversation with non-Christians and Christians alike. That's fun.
Yeah, for sure. And the best compliments come from your professors. Like it's so validating as a student who is trying to get their master's. Like it's great. So
Also have to, or I have
um
to remember that I'm starting this new job. I have to compliment
yeah.
students more. So that's
No,
helpful
yeah.
feedback.
No, yeah, it is very encouraging. Yeah, especially when they are like well respected in their institution and very good at what they do and stuff. But yeah, thank you so much for joining
Thank
me for
you.
this again. Thank you for going through the hassle for me.
Yeah.
For anyone who is watching, I would love to get your feedback in the comments. If you're not subscribed, obviously make sure you go do that. Go to the link, go to the description. You'll see all of the relevant links to me and new doctor Seth Hart and his work as well. So thank you guys again for watching. Again, thank you for joining me.